Okay, everybody. Good evening, Democrats.
Good
Good
evening,
evening,
Democrats.
Okay, that was pretty good, but I think everybody can unmute now for just a moment. There's a lot of mutes, so let's everybody unmute, and we'll do it one more time. 3, 2, 1. Good evening, Democrats.
Democrats.
Good evening, Democrats.
That sounded great. Okay, now I'm
Calling from Sacramento.
Okay, so welcome to the Santa Monica Democratic Club. My name is John Katz. I'm the president of the club, and we are going to be hearing in just a few moments from Congressman Adam Schiff. And Suzanne, I'm going to put you on. Hang on one second. Or do you want to explain?
Oh, I could do a little, sure. For anyone who needs Spanish interpretation, it will be simultaneously provided. Para cualquier persona que necesite interpretación en español, del inglés al español, simplemente hagan clic en el pequeño icono que va a aparecer en la pantalla cuando John lo active en un momento. So when John activates the feature in just a moment, you'll be able to select the interpretation feature if you need it from English into Spanish. Thank you. Gracias.
Okay, and that's ready to go for anyone who'd like to use that. Okay, so welcome. This is our first of 3 meetings where we're going to be hearing from the candidates who are running for United States Senate representing California as Senator Feinstein retires at the end of her term or possibly sooner. And we're looking forward to filling that seat with one of 3 really strong candidates who have come forward from the House of Representatives to run for Senate. We don't have too many open seats in the U.S. Senate in California. So we're excited to be able to fill this seat. And we're excited to be able to say that all 3 of the candidates who are running for this seat have confirmed with our club to come and visit us and speak to us about their campaign. So tonight we'll be hearing from Congressman Adam Schiff. And coming up at the end of this month, on May 31st, we'll be hearing from Congresswoman Barbara Lee. She will be coming in person and on Zoom. It's going to be our first hybrid meeting since COVID began. So if you're interested in coming in person, that's going to be at the Thelma Terry Center at the Virginia Avenue Park. And that meeting is going to be 6:30, doors open, 7 o'clock start time. And then a few days later, on June 3rd, we just confirmed with her campaign today that Representative Katie Porter is going to be joining us. That's a Saturday, special Saturday meeting where we'll be hearing from Representative Porter. Also at the Thelma Terry Center at Virginia Avenue Park, that one will be doors open at 4:30, and the Congresswoman will join us at 5 p.m. So we're excited. We have the opportunity to talk to all 3 candidates, and we put together some questions, most of which are going to be asked to all the candidates so that we have the chance to hear from equally on the same issues, the same set of issues to each candidate. And we're very excited. And then the last point I want to make before we welcome the congressman is that at our September meeting, so it'll be the last Wednesday in September, we will be voting to endorse in this Senate race. And so everybody who's interested in having a say, and according to our bylaws, that's any Democrat who lives in California would be able to vote in that endorsement race. It's not always the case. If it's a Santa Monica election or a regional election, you have to live in that jurisdiction. But since this is a statewide race, anyone in California is welcome to join the club, and you'll be able to vote in that endorsement, and that'll be in September. You just have to join 30 days before the meeting is held, or if you were a member in 2022, then you can join right up until the day. And so we'll announce the official date, but looking at the calendar, the last Wednesday is September 27th. So most likely that will be the date, and you'll have to join the club no later than August 27th in order to be able to vote in that endorsement. So I think I saw the congressman join the line. Is that correct?
Yep.
Hey, Congressman Schiff, great to see you. So let me give you a quick introduction and then we'll go to you. So Congressman Adam Schiff went to high school in the Bay Area and holds degrees from Stanford and Harvard. He began his career as a law clerk and assistant U.S. attorney before serving in the California State Senate for 2 terms. In 2000, he was elected to the U.S. House, where he served for 12 terms. He represents Pasadena, Glendale, Burbank, Hollywood, West Hollywood, and parts of LA. He chaired the House Intelligence Committee until being unceremoniously removed from it by Speaker McCarthy in the current term. Previously, he served on Appropriations and Foreign Affairs committees. In 2020, Representative Schiff served as impeachment manager for the first impeachment of Donald Trump. But of course, most notably in his resume, Congressman Schiff was honored with the Champion of Justice Award at the 2019 Sammy Awards of the Santa Monica Democratic Club. So we're honored to welcome back to SMDC our neighboring Congress member, Adam Schiff. Thanks for joining us.
John, thank you. Great to be with you.
So, Congressman, we have a series of questions that we're going to ask to you and to the other candidates who are running for Senate. Most of them are the same series of questions, but a few will be specific to you or eventually to your colleagues. So we'll just get started. There's 3 Democratic members of Congress running for the U.S. Senate. What do you believe that your service as senator would provide to the people of California that's different from what we would receive if one of your Democratic opponents were elected instead?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for your incredible activism. It's your hard work, along with millions of other good Democratic activists around the country that have really kept our democracy together during these challenging times. So I really appreciate everything you've done. And I'm running really to address 3 existential crises facing the state and the country. First is the threat to our democracy, which we saw on abundant display yesterday. The former president, now the leading Republican candidate for president, completely unapologetic, doubling down on his efforts to essentially dismantle our democratic institutions, pushing out the big lie about our elections, saying that he would pardon many of the insurrectionists. And sadly, we've seen in the history of the last presidency that every time he's not held accountable, he engages in worse and worse conduct. So our democracy remains very much at risk. And I want to continue the leadership I've demonstrated in defending our democracy. I think it is one of the things that sets me apart in this race. And that is during the most difficult times, the last 6 years, much of the last decade, I have played a leading role in the defense of our democracy. And that has been a singular role. And I think California has a right to expect that its senator will be in the leadership of those fights, not on the sidelines of those fights. And I think I played a vital role, and I want to continue to play that role in the U.S. Senate. I'm also fighting for an economy that works for everyone. And this too is, I think, part and parcel of the fight for our democracy. For too many years, the economy has not been working for millions of people. And we see that in the fact that while people are working and unemployment is at an historic low, yet they're not making enough to get by. And this is resulting in its most extreme form in literally in homelessness, but also in people's inability to be able to afford a home, in their difficulty in accessing quality health care, putting food on the table. And so attacking these inequities in our economy, fighting as I did for an expanded child tax credit that lifted 40% of the kids who are in poverty out of poverty, going after those in corporate America who are at war with labor unions. And I'm proud to have the support of labor, many statewide and local unions in this race, IATSE statewide and IBEW statewide, Amalgamated Transit Workers statewide, Teamsters locals and Painters locals, operating engineers and other locals, because I've been fighting for working people. And one of my top priorities in the Senate will be to strengthen collective bargaining rights. I'm not taking corporate PAC contributions in my Senate race, and I'm going to be continuing my fight for an economy that works for everyone. Finally, I'm going to fight to make sure that we protect the planet. This is the existential challenge of them all, climate change. And going back to Speaker Pelosi's first term as Speaker, I told her then we couldn't be too aggressive in our efforts to wean ourselves from fossil fuels. I supported an Apollo project-like effort to move to a green economy before there was a Green New Deal. And once there was a Green New Deal, I was proud to endorse it and co-sponsor it. So those are the issues I'm running on. I think the leadership I've shown in championing our democracy, as well as I think an unparalleled record of getting things done for Californians. Building light rail, and I'm considered the father of the Gold Line. Building the early earthquake warning system, which is something that I helped to pioneer in the West Coast. Bringing back resources, millions for homeless, passing legislation to bring up-to-date textbooks to our schools and enact a patient bill of rights. Legislation I passed to protect press freedom and attack nuclear proliferation. We're all progressives in this race, but I think have the best record of actually making progress on the issues important to Californians.
Great. Thank you so much. We'll now go to Melissa Goodman for the next question.
Great. Thank you so much. And thanks for being here. What specifically will you do to expand abortion access and to ensure Congress does not enact a nationwide abortion ban?
Well, I was proud to co-sponsor legislation to create a national right to abortion that Judy Chu has authored. And the problem, of course, now is trying to get that through again in the House when controlled by Republicans. So the first step is we're going to have to take back the House. And I'm proud of my efforts over the last decade to elect Democrats. I'm going to continue to do that. In the Senate, I'm going to fight to end the filibuster. I think the only way to restore reproductive freedom is by doing away with the filibuster so that we can pass a law to protect reproductive freedom. We also need to do away with the filibuster to enshrine voting rights. And I was very critical early on in the Biden administration when I felt that we should have been putting voting rights first in terms of our priorities when we control the House and the Senate and the White House. That is foundational. And so my first step would be do away with the filibuster, protect voting rights, but also restore reproductive freedom. And that's going to take control of both houses and doing away with the filibuster. Well, one other thing I would like to mention, though, on that topic, because I think the loss of reproductive freedom may be just the first right that we're losing. And that is, along with Hank Johnson, I'm the leading advocate and author of legislation to expand the Supreme Court and to impose a code of ethics on the Supreme Court and term limits on the Supreme Court. And I think an enlarged Supreme Court will also help to protect reproductive freedom, but other rights as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now for our next question, we'll go to our Political Action Committee member, Sam Cozzolino.
Hey, thank you for being here, Congressman Schiff. I am personally a high school student and been concerned about school shootings. What have you done in Congress to help prevent needless death related to guns, and what will you do if elected to the U.S. Senate? And on a specific issue, would you consider repealing the Second Amendment and supporting that motion?
I wouldn't support trying to amend the Constitution. But what I have been doing is basically because I think that would not be successful. And there are much better ways, I think, more successful ways to attack this problem. And what I would do is, and what I have done in the House, I've been carrying the gun safety bill, which Joe Biden has said may be the single most important gun safety reform. And I've been carrying it now for 6 to 8 years. And that is the bill that would repeal the gun industry's immunity from liability. In 2005, the NRA pushed through a bill, which I opposed, but others supported, including some Democrats, to confer on the NRA and the gun dealers and the gun makers a unique immunity where they could engage in wrongful conduct and negligent conduct. They could market guns to young people. They could be negligent in the handling of guns or the manufacture of them. There was no accountability. And my bill would repeal that immunity. It is probably the bill that frightens the gun industry the most because it goes after the profit motive. But I have also been a long champion of a ban on assault weapons, a ban on extended ammunition clips, truly universal background checks. I have marched for gun rights. I have pleaded for gun rights. I've introduced legislation to confer gun rights. I've had heated debates, as I did just this week and last week in the Judiciary Committee, fighting to pass gun safety legislation. And I want to continue to champion that in the Senate. Of all the issues, this I find the most excruciating, in the sense that we know what can be done to solve this problem. It's not like there aren't things that we know work. An assault weapons ban works. Background checks work. Other countries that have had just a single mass shooting have enacted some of these reforms, and they prevented the loss of countless lives. So we know what there is to do. And the good news is that Democrats in competitive districts in reddish states or purplish states who used to run away from this issue are now running towards it. Now, I've always been running towards this issue. I ran for Congress in 2000 against a Republican incumbent who had a A+ record from the NRA. I had an F record, and I beat him in a Republican-leaning district. And I have been solidly championing gun safety ever since, and I will continue to do so until we address this scourge.
Thank you. And now we'll go to Susan Shu.
Hi, Congressman. How are you? It's nice to see you.
Good.
My question is, the impacts of climate change are becoming more and more evident in our everyday lives, and the warnings by the scientific community regarding what the future holds without action is terrifying. What have you done in the past to address climate change, and what would you do as a United States Senator? And how will California deal with managed retreat in an effective way to ensure the safety of citizens, communities, and property?
I've used my seat at the leadership table to strongly advocate for co-sponsored champion green legislation, a Green New Deal, but also countless other bills to wean ourselves off of fossil fuels, to extend and make permanent tax credits to incentivize the development of renewable sources of energy, to put a tax on polluters. And so I have been a vigorous champion since day one of addressing climate. And that will not only continue, but intensify. The good news, I think, on the climate front is that science and technology here are a big part of the answer, and will help us get ahead of that tipping point, but only if we stop incentivizing fossil fuels that are killing the planet and killing a lot of Americans at the same time with the ill health effects of carbon in the air. And so I'm going to continue to champion renewable sources of energy. I've introduced legislation to place a windfall profits tax on the oil industry. We shouldn't be giving oil executives and shareholders a bonus and tax incentives to pollute. We should be giving those kind of incentives, tax credits to renewable energy, taking away tax benefits to the oil companies, and indeed, I believe, putting a windfall profits tax on the oil industry.
Thank you.
Okay, so the Republicans manipulated the Supreme Court appointment process over the last few years, first denying Merrick Garland a hearing for a year, then ramming through Amy Coney Barrett's appointment in just 3 weeks. The current Supreme Court represents a radical group intent on taking constitutional law back to a pre-New Deal era, thereby destroying women's rights, voting rights, and the ability of administrative agencies to address new problems. What have you done to date about the appointment manipulation and the radicalization of the Supreme Court? And what would you do going forward as a U.S. Senator?
Well, what I have been doing, and I think I was certainly the first of my colleagues to be advocating for an expanded Supreme Court. And I've been making exactly this argument, just the point that you just read in that question, to the Congress. And indeed, I got into what was, I think, a multi-hour long fight last night in the Judiciary Committee, making exactly this point, that McConnell had packed the court. And the Republicans took great umbrage. I could tell that I struck a nerve in saying, no, that's not court packing. Roosevelt tried to pack the court. That's something completely different. And my point was, no, there are different ways to pack the court. You can pack it by expanding it. You can pack it by withholding an appointment from one party and then jamming another appointment down, just as you expressed, while people were literally voting for a president of the other party, Joe Biden. And my House Judiciary colleagues, one of them told me recently, Adam, you're the perfect advocate for an expanded court. And then sort of like a mic drop, walked away without explaining what they meant by that. But I assume, I suspect what they meant by that is something that Jim Brolte, the Republican leader, once said to me when I was in the state legislature, when he came up to me on the Senate floor one day and he said, Adam, you're the worst kind of Democrat. You're the worst kind of Democrat. And I said, how is that, Jim? And he said, because you're just as progressive as all the rest, but you sound so damn reasonable. But I think if we're going to make the case for an expanded court, we have to begin to socialize the idea, and we have to approach it in a way that people will hear what we have to say. And what people need to understand is, yeah, packing the court is bad, and they did it. And they did it. There are two justices who are on the court who would not otherwise be there but for Mitch McConnell's court packing plan. And the result is that an entire generation of Americans have lost their reproductive freedom unless something is done about it. And I've got two kids, one 20, one 24. I am not content to have them live their whole adult lives under this reactionary court. As I pointed out to the Republicans last night, this is not a conservative court. A conservative court would have some respect for precedent. This is a reactionary court with a partisan agenda, willing to throw overboard decades of precedent. And the only remedy, I think, is to expand the court, to term limit the court, and to adopt an enforceable code of ethics.
Great, thank you. And so now we have a couple of questions on the topic of housing and homelessness, and we're going to go to our membership vice president, Mike Soloff, who's also the co-chair for Santa Monicans for Renters' Rights. Mike.
Thanks so much for joining us, Congressman Schiff. We're going to break this down into sort of three separate areas. We first want to talk about low-income Americans. And according to HUD, we have over 21.6 million rent-burdened lower-income households in the United States. Almost 10 million of those people who are lower income and paying more than 50% of their income for rent and utilities. And 2.6 million of those 21.6 rent burdened lower income households are here in California. We know there are effective solutions. Studies have shown that the Section 8 program is very effective, both the voucher portion and the creating new affordable housing. It reduces homelessness, and yet federal funding means that only 1 in 4 people who qualify economically for this assistance actually get it. So what have you done in the past to address this affordability crisis for lower income American households, and what would you do as a U.S. Senator?
Well, for many years, more than a decade, I've been a member of the Appropriations Committee, probably closer to 15 years. And I've been a staunch advocate, offering amendments, offering demands for greater support for Section 8 housing, for more affordable housing. I've carried legislation to expand eligibility for Section 8, expand the number of Section 8 vouchers, expand the amounts that are contained in each voucher, legislation that would help reduce the barriers and go after those who are refusing to rent to people who are using Section 8. I've helped countless constituents who have, at times won the lottery and gotten a Section 8 voucher, but had great difficulty in finding someone somewhere that would accept it. I've carried legislation to create tax incentives for the construction of more affordable housing. For years, carried a bill that would, for example, give you, if you sold your property to a nonprofit or to a public housing agency, the same for the purpose of affordable housing, the same kind of favorable tax treatment that you would get if your property had been condemned. Carrying legislation that would provide millions to expand the use of hotels and motels, assist states with those kind of conversions for either temporary shelter or more permanent housing. I have legislation that would create a navigator program, much like we had under the Affordable Care Act, to help people navigate to meet their housing needs and find out what's available and make it more accessible. And these are just some of the initiatives I've carried over the years. I have to say, in my efforts on the Appropriation Committee to increase funding for affordable housing and the availability of it, I've worked very closely with Barbara Lee, who's also been a great champion. We've carried measures, for example, to expand housing for people who are HIV and AIDS positive. We've worked on those issues together. I've supported, along with one of my other colleagues, Maxine Waters, her legislation to devote hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars to try to create more affordable housing. But finally, there are a number of solutions that don't involve housing per se, but they do involve what I mentioned at the very outset, and that is making the economy work for people so that they can afford housing. And I fought very hard to more than double the size of the child tax credit, for example. That lifted 40% of kids living in poverty out of poverty. That's not only a good anti-poverty program and maybe the most effective anti-poverty program we've had since the New Deal, but it's also, in a way, a housing program if it helps people afford to stay in their homes. So these are just some of the things I've done on this issue. I've also, for my district, brought back millions of dollars for local efforts to house people and local efforts to provide wraparound services for the unhoused. And I, as state senator, as U.S. senator, as state senator, I got state funding 25 years ago for Union Station in Pasadena. So this is not new for me. This has been an effort my whole career. But as a U.S. senator, I want to build on that and bring back much, much greater resources to California to help meet this challenge.
So turning now to other parts of the population, while rent burden is principally among lower and up to about median income of households, for households, that are above that, many face high rents and extremely high costs of purchasing homes that prevent them from living in high resource communities close to their jobs, and particularly in coastal areas. As to this aspect of the problem of housing affordability, what have you done in the past and what would you do as a U.S. Senator?
Well, what I've done in the past and would continue to do is try to incentivize the creation of more affordable housing. We do need more housing stock, so we have to make it more affordable to build affordable housing. We have to provide the incentives to do it. We have to provide the resources to do it. And we also have to help people afford it with basic income. I've supported pilots in universal basic income as well to help people be able to afford a place to live and meet basic necessities. On any given day, there are millions and millions of families that are just one health problem or car problem away from failure and becoming homeless. I've walked picket lines in Los Angeles for LA Unified School employees recently, for example, who were being paid $25,000 a year. If you're paid $25,000 a year, you're not going to be able to afford a place to live. And so part of it is increasing the supply of housing, which I have legislation I've been carrying and will continue to champion ways that we can incentivize through the tax code and elsewhere the construction of housing. I've supported state efforts to allow people to build more units on their property. I know that's controversial in many communities, but it is, I believe, part of the answer. But also a big part of the answer is raising incomes. And I think this gets back to a point I was making earlier. The decades-long attack by corporate America on labor and on collective bargaining has so hollowed out the middle class. I think that has been an enormous contributor to the fact that people can't afford a place to live because so many households are no longer union households, because the right to collective bargaining has been so undermined over decades. And so I also think this is a labor fight. And that's one I've been in since the very beginning.
Okay, now we'd like to turn to homelessness and what factors, in addition to the economic factors you've been talking about, do you think contribute to homelessness, and to these non-economic factors, what, if anything, have you done in the past on that issue, and what would you do as a U.S. Senator?
Well, in terms of non-economic factors, there are obviously also racial factors and discrimination against people on the basis of their race or their gender or their gender identity or their orientation. And these are all prejudices and bigotries that I've fought against for many years. Supporting fair housing legislation, supporting legislation that would make not just housing, but for example, healthcare, a civil right. I'm carrying a bill that would provide that equitable access to care is a civil right. And obviously equitable access to housing is also a civil right. So I support private rights of action to be able to enforce people's right to housing without being prejudiced against. I'm also supporting legislation along with Scott Peters in San Diego that would protect veterans who are using their GI support or others from being discriminated against by landlords. So there are a number of impermissible factors used to discriminate against people, whether they're using VASH vouchers or other means of payment like Section 8. And so I've also been hard at work to try to combat those obstacles to housing. I'm also working on legislation to make sure that people have good resources in different languages to help them access housing, because there can be language barriers also to people finding affordable housing. So these are some of the efforts I've initiated in the House, and I would be working on and developing further in the Senate.
And the last question we have in our time on this topic, for those who are already homeless and living on the streets, and we obviously have huge numbers of Americans, particularly here in California, but throughout the United States. Similar question, what have you done in the past to address their plight and the impact of their plight on local communities, and what would you do as U.S. Senator?
Well, I brought millions back to my district as a House member, and I think that's made a real difference. I brought millions back to innovative efforts to provide services to the homeless. And that's something I will continue to do, and I think to much greater effect representing the whole state than one community. But I think in how a representative has been able to deliver for their constituents, you can get a sense how they would deliver for the state. And I think my record sets me apart from some of my colleagues in bringing back millions to address homelessness. And I made it very clear with the communities I represent that this is my priority. And as they've applied for congressionally district appropriated funds, I made it clear this is our priority. And so we have given strong preference to local initiatives to address homelessness. But more than that, we need the kind of massive resources on the national level, treating this as the humanitarian crisis that it is. We are very proud, and I think we should be, of our infrastructure bill, the most massive investment in infrastructure in the nation's history. But our people are also our infrastructure. They're our most important infrastructure. We need a similar kind of investment to end this homelessness crisis. And so I support a much more massive infusion of resources directed to this problem, and will be championing it in the Senate.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And we're now going to go back to Susan Shu.
Hello again. The California Reparations Commission has documented once again the history of discrimination against Black Americans, the ongoing mostly the ongoing socioeconomic impacts. Black women and very young children are among those most impacted by racism and the lack of resources. What policy efforts and actionable steps can be implemented to improve maternal health and early child outreach for people of color?
Well, I'm carrying the leading bill in the House on exactly this issue, and it is a bill to provide equitable access to healthcare. I introduced this bill years ago, and it is the support of a broad range of organizations, including NAACP and the Urban League, among others. I introduced this bill years ago to address the very real problem that once people do get access to care at a hospital or a clinic or elsewhere, they often get very disparate treatment based on the color of their skin or some other impermissible factor. And this bill would establish an Office of Civil Rights at HHS. It would provide for administrative action in the event of disparate care on the basis of race. And if the government failed to act, it would create a private right of action so individuals could sue. Importantly, the legislation also requires that hospitals and clinics maintain data so that we can determine whether access is being denied on the basis of the color of your skin. And so it requires both the data to make the determination as well as the legal remedy. So this is one of the initiatives that I've carried and led in the House of Representatives. And I've also worked hard on the Tri-Caucus legislation. That is the Black Caucus and Hispanic Caucus and the AAPI Caucus also have a variety of health equity proposals. And portions of my bill have been incorporated into that larger effort as well. But that in that area, I have been one of the leaders in the House.
Thanks. Let's go back to Sam.
Hey, Congressman Schiff. We've seen it yesterday with Title 42 ending, that the status quo has come back with people being turned away, families being separated. How will you, if elected to the U.S. Senate, ensure that this inhumane treatment ends, and how does your policies differentiate yourself from the Biden administration or status quo?
Well, I favor doing away with Title 42. So I would have done away with Title 42 well before now. Title 42 was a health measure, ostensibly, anyway. And when the health crisis ended, it should have ended. And so I don't support a continuation. I would not have had it as prolonged as it was under the administration. I don't support the administration's changes to the asylum rules. And I spoke out against similar proposals in the Judiciary Committee. There are people fleeing violence who come between ports of entry. And I think the current approach, which would penalize them, which would potentially criminalize them, enact 5 or 10-year bars to reentry, I don't think is fair, just, or equitable. And I think it means that a lot of people fleeing violence may suffer violence in third countries as a result. So I don't agree with these asylum policies. I also will say in the area of self-criticism of the Democratic Party that, while it is certainly true, Republicans have no interest in solving this problem. Everything doing is making this problem worse. Nevertheless, and I made this point earlier today in discussing this with Wolf Blitzer, nevertheless, when Democrats controlled the House and the Senate and the White House, we didn't use the political capital we needed to get this solved. And that has to change. The next time we control both houses and the White House, we need to fix this. And we need to fix it whether the Republicans want to work constructively with us or they don't. We need an immigration policy that is consistent with our values, that don't put people in cages, that doesn't force people to live places where their lives are going to be in danger, where they're going to be raped or murdered. And so I don't think our immigration policy is consistent with our values. I don't think that we have done everything that we could have and should have done to fix this when we controlled everything. And that needs to change. So I have a number of differences with the current approach. And I'm pushing back vigorously against the draconian bill the Republicans passed in the House today, as I fought it in the Judiciary Committee. But I also have differences with how the administration has handled this to date.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Melissa, go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Congressman. I'm going in a different direction now to privacy and surveillance. You know, over your career have been very involved in the issue of whether the US government should be engaged in dragnet, warrantless collection of data and phone records of people in the US, generally, those communicating with people abroad. And one of the key laws that authorizes that is set to expire again at the end of this year. At the last sunset period, you were perceived, or at least there was a lot of news reports about you being part of an effort that blocked more progressive and significant reforms at that particular sunset moment. So what is your position on that issue now, and how will you or would you vote on whether the current law should now sunset, and why?
Yeah, I remember that now that you bring it up. When it's sort of a whisper campaign, my positions were misrepresented. In fact, I was working with Pramila Jayapal and Zoe Lofgren to try to come about with a reform package that we were not successful with. But I'm proud that when I was the chair of the Intel Committee, we did end the telephone metadata program. That's something that I pushed to bring an end to. And many years before that, Jeff Flake and I teamed up to end the Bush wireless wiretapping program. So I have a long history of reform in this area, and I'll continue and will be pushing for reforms to our surveillance efforts to make sure that they're consistent with human rights and that they're protective of our privacy. I'm very proud that when I was the chair, we passed some very strong reforms that enjoyed the overwhelming support of the Democratic caucus, including many, if not most, progressives. I think we ended up passing one of those bills with close to 390 some odd votes, which is most members of the House. And so I'm very proud of the reform efforts that I've undertaken. I'll be looking to attack any abuses that have been demonstrated. Some of these programs obviously are important to our national defense, those that are focused on foreign parties operating on foreign soil, engaging activities that pose a threat to the United States. But we have to make sure that in the midst of those efforts that we're certainly not deliberately collecting and that we're reducing any unintended collection that involves Americans or US residents. That's certainly been my consistent policy all along, and that's what I'll continue to do.
Thank you. And now next we'll go to Natalia.
Thank you, Representative Schiff. What are your views on the response to date by the United States to the Russian invasion of Ukraine? And what, if anything, do you think the United States should do differently in the future in response to that invasion?
Here, while I may have differences with the Biden administration over their immigration policy, I don't differ with what the president has done vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think he has handled Ukraine extremely well. As you may know, I went on the first codel of House members with Speaker Pelosi to Ukraine during the war. I've taken a deep interest in this by virtue of the work I was doing as chair of the Intel Committee until Mr. Nunes removed me from that position. And I think what the president has done is provide Ukraine with the support to defend itself up until the point, but no further, that it might risk bringing the United States into its own armed conflict with Russia. So I think the Biden administration has done a masterful job of uniting the rest of the world around sanctions, of providing Ukraine with the support it needs to defend itself and hopefully expel the Russian invaders and avoid getting us into a direct conflict with Russia. And I think that is what we need to continue to do. I wish I could tell you there's an easy off-ramp here, but there isn't. And if Putin is successful, I think it would be utterly catastrophic for the people of Ukraine. But more than that, I think it would be utterly catastrophic for an international rules-based order that has served us well since World War II, in which nations aren't allowed to remake the map in Europe or elsewhere just by using military force. So I think we should continue strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. I think we should continue to do what the president has done and be very careful not to escalate, but nonetheless to support a democratic people's aspiration to chart their own future, to have their own sovereignty and self-determination. I think that's very consistent with our values.
Thank you. Well, now we're going to go to Cynthia Hart from the Culver City Democratic Club.
Good evening, Representative Schiff. Not to bring up a bad subject or anything, but you voted for the authorization to use military force that allowed President Bush to invade Iraq. As a U.S. Senator, would you vote to repeal the AUMF?
Yes, and in fact, I also introduced one of the first bills to repeal the AUMF. I think I may have had the first bill to do that. Barbara Lee and I, we're close to each other in terms of whose bill came first, and have worked on that in parallel for many years. So yes, in terms of the Iraq war, I was misled by the representations about the intelligence. I was not on the committee at the time, but I think that war was a terrible mistake. And I have long supported the repeal of that authorization, as well as the repeal of the authorization to use force in Afghanistan, which has existed long past what its intention and intended purpose was. But I'm proud to have introduced the first legislation, for example, to provide due process to people during that war in Guantanamo, and also proud to have introduced among the first legislation, if not the first, to repeal or narrow those authorizations to use force.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we have one last question for you, Congressman. I heard you have to leave soon, but we just wanted to ask you with regard to another example of Republicans seeking to impose minority rule. They're using the debt ceiling law and the threat of cratering the U.S. and world economy through a default to impose their will on a Democratic Senate and Democratic president. So I know you're in the middle of dealing with that issue right now. What do you believe can and should be done to end this debt limit blackmail once and for all?
Well, I think we need to get rid of this whole debt ceiling concept to begin with. It is one Congress imposed on itself, and it serves no constructive purpose except allowing an irresponsible party to jeopardize the economy, to try to force its will on the American people in the form of a draconian austerity budget that would deprive food of people who are hungry, deprive veterans of health care, and in other ways, innumerable ways, wreak havoc on our country. So I would favor getting rid of the debt limit. But in the near term, I think the president is right not to negotiate with hostage takers. And I hope the administration holds firm, because if they relent or agree to some austerity budget, number one, austerity budget will throw us into recession, and the most harmed will be the most vulnerable. But also it will just set the precedent for them to do it over and over and over again. So I would do away with this whole leverage point to begin with.
Thank you so much. And I understand you have to go, but I wanted to give you the chance if you wanted to make any closing remarks before we say goodbye.
Well, thank you again for inviting me. I appreciate the opportunity to do this, even if it's in only 2 dimensions on Zoom. I would just like to say, I think there are a number of structural challenges to our democracy. And we see this in the resulting dysfunction in our country. The first is the gerrymander in the House, which is, again, getting back to why I strongly wanted to take up voting rights as the first thing we did and outlaw the gerrymander, among other things. Because of the gerrymander, a minority of Americans often control the House. Because of the overweighting of rural states in the Senate, a minority of Americans also generally control the Senate. And I strongly favor admitting the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico, if they choose to be part of the Union, to not only bring that benefit to the Union, but also address that disproportionate weighting of those rural states, something that the Republicans did in the mid-1800s for exactly the purpose of trying to control the Senate. And we are living with the consequences a century and a half later. Finally, I'm also a big champion of a multi-state compact to functionally do away with the Electoral College. Because with the Electoral College, a minority of Americans often occupy or control the presidency. And the combination of these three structural problems, a House that's in the hands often of the minority, a Senate often in the hands of the minority, and a presidency often in the hands of the minority, has resulted in the least representative body in the country being the Supreme Court. And so these are, I think, also structural challenges we need to address. And like the Republicans who had a 40-year plan to repeal reproductive freedom, we need a near, mid, and long-term plan to restore our democracy and the health of our democracy. Be proud to have your support in the campaign and to continue championing our democracy, fighting for an economy that works for everyone, and fighting to save our planet, working with you side by side. And thanks for having me on tonight.
Thank you so much, Congressman Schiff. We really appreciate you coming by. We also, of course, appreciate your leadership in the House, and thank you so much for that, and good luck in the campaign.
Thank you very much. Have a great night, everybody.
Thank you. Okay, so we'll now be moving on to, we have some legislative business to attend to. Before we do that, Keith, are you on the line? I know you had an announcement you wanted to make at this point in the meeting.
Yes, I am. We are bringing the Sammys back this year, and we're looking towards the end of August, perhaps the beginning of September, to ensure that folks are back from any kind of potential summer break that they may be having. And we are very keen on having folks be a part of the committee for us to have a great Sammys this year, so that we can raise money to continue to have the proper budget for the club to do its good work. So we'll be sending out some information related to that, so that folks can sign up and we can get a good solid Sammys. So folks can look out for that information in the email coming up soon.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you, Keith. And so if anyone's interested right now in joining that committee, the fundraising committee, all you have to do is send an email to Keith or to myself. Anybody on the board, you can reply to the Zoom link email that you got today from the club and just say, hey, I'm interested in helping out with the fundraising tasks. You don't have to be personally connected to a bunch of millionaires to be able to be part of that committee. You can help in many different ways, including just like the party planning of it all and getting the event to run without a hitch when we actually get to the Sammys. So reach out, let us know if you're interested in helping us out. It's a very important project for the club. Okay, now I'm going to turn things over. Unfortunately, our legislative chair, Isabel Story, is not able to be here this evening. So in her stead, we'll be hearing from Mike Soloff to shepherd us through 5 bills we're going to be taking out for consideration tonight.
Thanks, John. Isabel regrets she can't be here tonight, but she actually has some lifelong learning in a class this evening that she can't afford to miss. So I think we should honor that commitment to lifelong learning. It's certainly consistent with the values of this club. We have 5 bills, all of which have gone through our legislative committee and also through the executive board. What we're going to do is present all 5 of them. Then we'll determine if there's any that anybody wants to ask to be removed to be considered separately, and then either we'll vote on all 5 of them, or if there's something that people want to remove and consider separately, that will be pulled, and we'll do that. So we're going to begin with Assembly Bill 309, and Janice Schnittman is here. She's taken the lead on that in the legislative committee, and she will explain to you briefly what the bill is about and why we support it.
Hi, everyone. So this bill is about establishing a California State Social Housing Authority, which would be a means for the state to create what would be, in essence, a public option for housing. There are countries, social housing can have
different definitions. It's not the same thing as what we have come to call public housing in the United States, which is government built, government owned housing. Social housing can include that, but there are other models that it's basically nonprofit housing. So it can be done, in conjunction with nonprofit entities. But the whole idea of social housing is that it is outside of the private market, which means it is outside of speculation. And it uses the basic model that it can be ownership housing. There are models that allow for limited equity ownership. When it's rental housing or limited equity ownership, the model is either it's new purposely built constructed housing, or it can be taken over existing housing that would be in danger of being lost, of existing affordable housing. And the idea is that because there'd be no profit taking, you could have the cross subsidization of what would be market level rents because you don't have a private entity taking the profit out, would enable subsidy of people who could be living in the same excellent quality housing, integrated housing, and presumably enabling us to put that housing in all kinds of neighborhoods, including the higher resourced ones. So it promotes social integration. It provides the public benefit that during recessionary times, when it would be a great time to build housing, the public entities would be the social housing entities would be able to do it at times when private investors would not be building, and we keep our construction workforce busy during these countercyclical times. Basically, all upsides and no downsides. If anybody has ever been lucky enough to visit Vienna, over 60% of people in Vienna live in social housing. It has a particular advantage over American style public housing, which was that when we did build public housing, even when it had idealistic intentions, because it was only for poor people, it didn't have the buy-in of universal programs. There's a big difference between Social Security and our public schools and programs that are means tested and therefore subject to periods when you have political power that that doesn't want to invest in it. So social housing, AB 309. I hope that the Dem Club will post the letters, because there was a hearing this week in appropriations, which sent it to suspense yesterday. The executive board sent a letter so that it could weigh in before we had a chance for the club as the membership to also endorse it. But I hope that the letter that I drafted will be posted, and I will make a point that, like for the letter that I wrote supporting Ted Lieu's AI bill, it was done without any artificial intelligence researching, writing, or drafting. I am very concerned about the amount of public comment that will be based on spurious chat, and it'll be bots talking to bots and take out any meaningful. So for me, I'm going to be taking a stand, and I hope you'll read that letter that has already been sent out on behalf of the exec board, and I hope that the membership will ratify it.
Thanks, Janice. Does anybody have a question about that bill before we move on to the next one? If you're gonna raise a question, please use your reactions hand, because I won't be able to scan all of the things. Rebecca?
I've worked in social housing, and I was wondering if this bill would be competitive with some of the religious groups that build social housing. I mean,
not competitive, complementary.
Okay.
Absolutely complementary.
Okay, not seeing any other hands on this. The next bill we're going to talk about is AB 642, and Dolly Sloan is going to present to us on that bill. Just have to unmute, Dolly.
Good evening, everyone. At present, there is no legal support in California for mass facial surveillance. AB 642, however, while purporting to regulate its use in law enforcement and public safety, will create this ipso facto without going through the intensive public vetting, discussion, and evaluation that must happen before approval of any use of mass facial surveillance can take place. That's why the bill is opposed by the ACLU and other civil rights organizations. The executive board recommends a no vote for legislators on this bill and asks for membership support. Here is a quick summary of why, with thanks to the ACLU summary on an email that woke me up on its existence and the perils that it faces, that we face if we pass it. AB 642 will lead to the expansion of face surveillance technology, which hurts Black and brown people who already are subject to over-policing and racial profiling. It will allow law enforcement to use facial surveillance to track the movements of those who are seeking refuge in California, including undocumented immigrants and people in need of reproductive and gender-affirming care. Facial surveillance will cause significant harm and make racial disparities worse in the criminal legal system. And facial surveillance is the digital equivalent of stop and frisk or show me your papers. It lets the government do things that we'd never accept in this non-digital world. So we urge you to agree with the board that legislators should vote no, and we support a no response to this.
Any questions on this bill before we move on? Okay, seeing none, we'll now move on to ACA 10. And Leonora Kamner is going to speak to us about that bill.
Yes, thank you. I jumped on just at the right time. So ACA 10 is the state constitutional right to housing. And it is, not intended just to be a standalone fix to the housing crisis. It's a part of a multi-year effort and a campaign to increase the political will and the urgency around solving the housing crisis. ACA 10 will recognize that every Californian has the fundamental human right to adequate housing on an equitable and non-discriminatory basis. Under this bill, the California voters would have the opportunity to vote to add this right to the state's constitution. Guaranteeing the right to housing would mean ensuring that all Californians have access to housing that is permanent, habitable, affordable, culturally appropriate, and close to community resources like employment, healthcare, and schools. So state and local governments can use a wide variety of measures to implement the right, including tenant protections, regulations, public housing, housing subsidies, and progressive tax policy. While the government may choose the methods by which it achieves the right, it does have that obligation in place that creates a moral and constitutional requirement to realize the right of adequate housing for all Californians. The idea of creating a right to housing is not new. Franklin Roosevelt, in his 1944 State of the Union address, declared that every family in the United States should have the right to a decent home. In 1948, the United States signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which recognizes adequate housing as a human right. In 2020, polling showed that 66% of all Californians support an amendment ensuring the human right to housing. And so this is a coalition including, behind AC 10 includes like my organization, Abundant Housing LA, ACE, End Poverty in California, Housing Now, ACLU California Action, National Homelessness Law Center, Western Center on Law and Poverty, and Power California Action. So that concludes my description of ACA 10.
Does anybody have any questions on that bill? Okay, seeing none, we'll now move on to SB 423, and Leonora is going to address that one as well.
Thanks, everybody. So California needs the 3 Ps to address the housing and homelessness crisis. So it's like kind of we're moving from the right to housing to like, okay, how do we actually achieve housing for all and affordable housing for all? So the 3 Ps framework is the idea that we need to simultaneously move forward protections, protections for people, for renters and people in housing, preservation of affordable housing, and of course, production of new housing. So SB 35 is a housing production, kind of like an accountability bill. That says if a city is behind on arena category, that it streamlines, it doesn't like change the zoning or anything, but it streamlines certain types of projects, to kind of like help. It's almost like kind of correcting the problem. It's like helping housing production move forward at the income levels that are needed to achieve the arena. But SB 35 has not been effective in achieving the scale of production. And so even though it has been a successful policy in the sense that it demonstrated that streamlining is an engine of creating subsidized affordable housing, through 2018 through 2022, it was effective at streamlining affordable housing. It streamlined the approval of over 13,000 new affordable homes. Thousands of units have been completed or are under construction, and construction workers were paid a family sustaining prevailing wage. Most projects are built with union labor, and in Los Angeles, developers fast-tracked approval for 33 projects for a total of nearly 3,000 units, and about 98% of those units are affordable. SB 423 would make improvements to SB 35 so that like we can get it to, we can build on the successful policy to get to the scale that's needed. Again, like it hasn't like scaled up to the level that's needed. So SB 423 makes SB 35 permanent. It has updated large arena targets. It's in the context of updated large arena targets, and SB 423's amendments make mixed income housing developments more feasible. So it would end the sunset on SB 35 and continue to authorize streamlined ministerial approval processes for infill developments in local jurisdictions that have failed to meet their RENA goals. And so that is only in effect if the development is located on a site that is both urban infill and zoned for residential or mixed use. It also allows SB 35 to be used in coastal areas, which tend to have more expensive housing. And so that makes these coastal areas more accessible. It allows SB 35 to be used on surplus public land, making it faster and easier to build affordable housing on hundreds of acres of underutilized property. The construction labor standards include the strongest enforceable prevailing wage requirements in the country, while requiring developers to provide health benefits to their workers and give preference to apprentices when they are available. SB 423 applies SB 35 to cities whose housing element does not yet meet the state requirements. So severely needed affordable housing moves forward while those cities update their plans. SB 35 allows for expedited review and can cut approval times of projects between 6 months and a year. This is a bill that has a lot of labor backing. This was came from a coalition including the California Housing Consortium, the California Conference of Carpenters, Inner City Law Center, the Local Initiative Support Corporation, California YIMBY, and like many other organizations. Abundant Housing LA is a supporter, SCAMP is a supporter, United Way, NPH, really, really big coalition list behind this bill. So let me know if I can answer any more questions about this bill.
Just before we turn to questions about that, we had a very extensive discussion of this at the executive committee because the labor provisions are controversial. There are labor unions supporting that, but the building trades unions oppose the changes from SB 35 and their labor standards. We heard from, in addition to the supporters of the bill, from the communications director for the LA County and Orange County Business and Building and Construction Trades Council on their views. And on that, the recommendation of the executive board is that we take no position on the labor provisions, that will have to get worked out in the legislature, but that we're not going to pick between those two. That's our recommendation. We also heard, although they didn't send a representative, but we had received information from other social justice organizations that believe that the inclusionary zoning portions of the bill need some tweaking. And in the letter we sent to the legislature on behalf of the executive, because they're racing far faster than we can, we took no position on that as well. But we support the bill and, you know, SB 385 continuing in the future. But on those things where traditional Democratic constituencies were divided, we felt that it was better to leave it alone in our own position. We also made clear that we view this as part of an overall response, which I think Leonora effectively stated there, but including have to spend a lot more money at the state level on all of this. And I'll just note that SB 309, for example, AB 309 says, you know, we're gonna have this fund to build the social housing upon appropriation. There's no money yet appropriated for that. ACA 10, which we support, giving a right, is going to require money if we're going to really make that real for people. So that's the position that the executive board took, was to make clear in the letter that we view that as well. So we support the bill, but with the recommendation that we stay neutral on those two pieces. And now I see Jean has a question, and if there are others who have questions, please raise your hands. Go ahead, Jean. Oh, sorry, Geraldine, I apologize. I guess I was thinking, showing how old I am, I was remembering All in the Family, and I was thinking.
Close.
Right.
Oh, yeah, I get asked that a lot, but thank you. I was just wondering that the list of opposition of all these cities is astronomical, and then including the League of California Cities, and I think the only, in fact, Sherman Oaks Homeowners Association, which is in Los Angeles. However, I'm seeing that it doesn't include Los Angeles, but so that's what I was wondering about. It seems like it has strong opposition. So I was just wondering where all of that come from. And then you did kind of explain some of it, but yeah, I would think that this is something that we probably should remain neutral on until we have more information in terms of the areas that you did talk about in terms of looking for change. So I would probably, or support if amended, to see where it goes, because I guess just personally I'm a little leery of anything Wiener does when it comes to housing. So, but I understand the reason that you would want to support it, but that's my 2 cents. Thanks.
Leonora, did you want to say anything in response to that? Or I might have a comment or two, but like to
Yeah,
go.
I definitely would love to respond to that. Thank you. I mean, I'm just consistently disappointed with the League of California Cities' lack of leadership on dealing with housing and homelessness. I mean, I think there's a clear problem in this state, and I've never seen any solutions come out of League of California Cities. We've tried communicating with them about it. I mean, I think it's tough because I think that their lobbying team sees their mandate as protecting cities' rights at all costs, but I think that's you know, that's a race to the bottom kind of situation because, you know, housing and homelessness solutions like require cities to come together around, like requiring accountability together. And like the League of California Cities, like does not, like they will not consider taking support positions on that kind of thing. So, like, I don't think that their approach, that there's any pathway to like serious solutions to the housing and homelessness crisis with the approach that they're taking. You know, I mean, like, I think SB 35 is like a fair tool. I think it's like, it's not like punishment, it's a constructive solution. And, you know, ultimately the League of Cities, you know, it's like, it's supposed to be serving the people of California. You know, it's not supposed to be, it's like supposed to be protecting their rights, not cities' rights. So I do think that that's like problematic and something like we should all think about with the League of California Cities. And I'm sorry, was there like another question I could address about it?
Yeah, I only had one
So-
other comment. I understand that public housing, that there was supposedly a law that that's not allowed in California. So that would be something that needs to be changed to be able to build public housing. But we definitely need, we have a need for public housing, that's for sure. Of course, that's pertaining to 309.
Yeah, and
So let me make a couple of comments about that. So first of all, you're talking about Article 34 of the Constitution. And as we discussed at the last meeting, when we considered SB 469, which this club has endorsed, that even as it exists today, it's not all public housing. There's a specific language that's in that, and the courts have been generally open to narrowly construing what that is, and the legislature has created a variety of exceptions to that going forward. And one of the things that SB 469 would do is make clear that basically anything that's getting funding from the state doesn't fall under that amendment. And that amendment does say that the legislature has some power here. So I don't think it's
Good.
quite the concern that you're talking about, although I am a lawyer, so I understand there could be litigation, but I'm just telling you what I looked at there. The other thing is we'll all have the opportunity to vote to repeal that in the 2024 election, because it's already passed the legislature that will be on the ballot. In addition, many localities, including our own, have already taken steps to exempt, for example, our local funding sources, specifically say that they're exempt. That the people, when we voted for those, said, and anything that's supported by these monies doesn't fall within it. So, and then I just wanted to go back to your prior question, because I'm somebody who believes that there's a lot of discussion about the housing crisis that isn't always accurate at all levels of government. But I do think that, number one, what SB 35 has done and what SB 423 will continue to do is allow for expedition of affordable housing projects, 100% affordable housing projects. That's a policy we in Santa Monica have had locally for a long time. And that makes a big difference in terms of what the cost is, and therefore takes those public dollars that we have and makes them go further. And that's a very good thing, and we need that. Secondly, I think that while in our own city, we have met our market rate RENA by 2.5 times in the last 2 cycles. There are a lot of cities in California where people truly are resistant to building any housing. And I do think that there needs to be some opportunity to do that. And I think, as Leonora said, this is one that doesn't change the local zoning. It just says, if you're not going to get it built, we can speed up the process, which allows us to do it. So I think it's quite reasonable in that way. It does have some inclusionary zoning. It does have some labor protections. There's some dispute over what exactly they should be going forward, but I personally think with that package, and I think that's certainly been the recommendation of the legislative committee and the executive board, that on balance, that's good. And simply the strict that, you know, there's no role for the state to play in expediting this is not the position that at least the legislative committee and the board has recommended, I think, for the reasons that Leonora and I have articulated.
Could I just add one thing, Michael?
Absolutely.
I think it would send a really important and powerful message for the Santa Monica Democratic Club to support this bill, like especially with this League of California Cities position that's being taken. And I think like that cities do look to Santa Monica for housing leadership. And you know, seeing a like a small city, like a well-resourced small city, like stand up for this and like stand up for the 3 Ps and stand up for local accountability. I think it would be like a really important stand to take, and it would be strongly noticed throughout the state.
And I just say that for me, I'm not sure which of your Ps it falls into, but the state getting serious about spending money on this project problem, particularly for lower income people, because that's the only way we're going to solve that, is critical. The state took away redevelopment funding, which was the single largest source of funding for affordable housing in the state of California during the financial crisis. And for over a decade, they didn't even get back to where they had been before that in real dollars. So I think the message that we're sending, and it's an important one, is that all of these tools have to be used. Not one of them by themselves will be sufficient to deal with all of the problem. Any other questions on this one before we go to the last bill? And then, so we'll go over the last bill, then we'll find out if anybody wants to pull any for separate consideration, and then we'll take the votes. But our last bill, sorry, I have to go back to a different screen. Well, I know it's Sam, so Sam, can you, since I don't have that email up that has the number of the bill, can you tell everybody the number of the bill as well as what it's about?
Of course, yes. So Senate Bill 434. I can put the information in the chat. But basically, it's for public transportation, and it allows for more surveys to be done for people near bus stops and metro stops, so that the California legislator is able to understand better the needs of transit riders, of public transit riders, especially for people who don't speak English and other minorities. It's specifically for harassment on public transportation. As we've seen, there's been an uptick in different abuse on public transportation, and even so, there's been a internalized fear that allows for a lot of people to not ride the metro and the bus, and that's horrible for the environment, and also very challenging for all the people who have to ride the bus and the metro because of lack of wealth, and they're more likely to be abused. And this survey is one step in trying to have safer public transit without more police, because we've seen that more police is not the answer, because it actually just makes things worse and more unsafe. So for the main sponsor, it's Stop API Hate, and there are so many supporters you can see in the fact sheet. I've been in contact with David Minn's chief of staff. Senator Minn is the author, and I've also been in contact with the head of advocacy for Chinese for affirmative action, and she also works with Stop API Hate, and she's really heading advocacy. So basically what's happening with the bill is that next week it'll come out of suspense and the full Senate will vote on it. So I'm drafting a letter to send out in support of this bill, and especially if we all vote in support, I'll be able to say it's all the Santa Monica Democratic Club instead of the executive board, and I'll send that out to show our support, so then it could pass the Senate and then make its way through the assembly. So there's still a little bit to go, but really in for the long haul. It is going pretty quickly, and please, if you have any questions.
So I have some bad news for allergy sufferers. There is.
Does anybody have any questions about SB 434? Okay, seeing none. Now, is there anybody who wants to pull any of these 5 bills for separate voting and consideration? I'm not seeing anybody raising a hand on that. Okay, so then what we'll be voting on is the 5 bills, including the recommendation of the executive committee, the caveats on 423. So, oh, Patricia.
I believe I see Janet Carter raising her hand. No? Oh, okay. Sorry.
I think she was, I noticed that. I think she was just typing and doing that. Okay. So last chance, if anybody wants to pull anything, please raise your reactions hand. Okay, not seeing that. So we're now going to vote. Everybody who's in favor of the 5 bills with the executive committee's recommendations on 423, please raise your hand. And if you could raise your hand using your reactions hand, please, because it's hard to try and scroll through and find physical hands.
I'm seeing 24 hands raised, 26.
Okay, we'll give you another 15 seconds. Anybody else want to vote in favor of the recommendation? The 5 bills. Okay, do you have a solid count there, Natalia?
Yep, it's been stuck at 26 for a couple seconds now.
Okay, great. So now if everybody could lower their hands. Keep lowering your hands. Oops, I thought I lowered my own hand and I didn't do it. Tom, Fran, Janice. Can you, okay, good. Now, is there anybody opposed to the 5 bills as with the caveats from the executive committee on 423?
I don't see any hands raised, but there was a thumbs up a second ago. I don't know if that person meant to raise their hand.
Is there someone who's opposed to the bill?
Yeah, sorry, that was me. I couldn't get
No problem.
got the thumb in the hand was kind of the same thing. So I did oppose 23.
It's only that it shows up in a different place on the,
Okay,
you're looking at it. So that's why we just wanted to be sure, Ann. So we'll mark that down as a no vote. Any other people voting no? Okay, with that, then I think the membership has endorsed their recommendations, and thank you to everybody. Thank you to everybody on the legislative committee who participated in these bills, who are leading these bills, most of whom you heard from tonight, to Isabel for running that committee, and to the executive committee for taking serious time to review these bills as well. And thank you to all the members for considering them. John, back to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mike, for leading that part of the meeting. And thanks everybody for coming. And before we go, just a reminder that our upcoming meetings, we have Congresswoman Barbara Lee coming on May 31st in person and on Zoom So you can arrive at the Thelma Terry Center at 6:30 p.m. or on Zoom at 6:30 p.m. And the Congresswoman will be arriving at 7. And then again, a few days later, Saturday, June 3rd, Congresswoman Katie Porter will be in person at the Thelma Terry Center and also on Zoom. And that meeting will start at 4:30 p.m. with the Congresswoman beginning to speak at 5 p.m. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate it. And now we will close out in loving memory of Gordon Lightfoot.